Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. I missed you all last week. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I will be stamping my images in VersaFine Clear Nocturne Black ink and embossing them with clear embossing powder. I am using this altenew Winter Crocus stamp set and this Simon Says stamp collaboration with Picket Fence Studios and coloring with my Zig watercolor pens. I did stamp all of the images in both of these stamp sets, but when I was finished coloring the crocuses, I realized I probably had enough footage to leave it in real time to get through our story this week. So I did not end up coloring the Christmas reindeer, Christmas tree little girl image that you will see stamped. I'll save those for next week. We have next week will be after Christmas, so I don't know when I'll get around to those. Maybe I'll color them anyway and save them for next year. I am going to go ahead and put some anti-static embossing powder down on my watercolor paper so that the embossing powder only sticks to the ink. And I'm going to stamp all the images twice, or ink rather, all the images twice because I've not used either one of them before. Okay. The only other thing, ignore the bruises on my hands. I know they look gnarly. They are healing. It's just a side effect of needing blood work done last week. So, okay. Now that we have finished the coloring, let's talk about our crime. So we are traveling to the state of Missouri this week. As early as 1817, Missourians seeking to move beyond territorial status began petitioning Congress for statehood. At that time, the 22 states comprising the United States of America were divided equally between slave states and free states, balancing representation in Congress. Because admitting Missouri as a state would tip the balance one way or the other, debate ensued over what to do with Missouri's application. While the debate over Missouri was pending, the citizens of the Maine territory also applied for statehood. And with both applications before Congress, Senator Harry Clay of Kentucky proposed a compromise. In exchange for Missouri's admission as a slave state, the Northern Territory of Maine would be admitted as a free state, ensuring representation in Congress remained equal. This became known as the Missouri Compromise. Another part of this compromise banned slavery north of a particular latitude line running through the Louisiana Purchase area. Although most of Missouri's territory is north of that line, it was exempted from the slavery ban. Congress approved the compromise and granted Maine statehood in March of 1820, which we've already talked about. And then due to further concerns with a provision in Missouri's Constitution, a second compromise was necessary. The Missouri Territorial Legislature approved this compromise in June of 1821, and Congress granted Missouri statehood. President James Monroe signed the federal legislation August 10, 1821, officially making Missouri the 24th state in the Union. Missouri is known as the Show Me State. It is home to the most powerful earthquake to strike the United States, occurring in 1811, and is recorded to having the most destructive tornado in the history of the U.S. In 1925, the tri-state tornado destroyed 90% of Missouri. Weird, I know. Missouri is also home to 4 Nobel Prize winners, but it is illegal in Missouri for more than 4 unrelated persons to occupy the same dwelling. Some holdover from brothel laws. Missouri was the 3rd most fought over state in the Civil War, right after Virginia and Tennessee. The first ready mixed food to be sold commercially was Aunt Jemima pancake flour. And the ice cream cone was invented at the Missouri World's Fair in 1904. Missouri is home to some infamous Americans like Jesse James, and some famous Americans like Laura Ingalls Wilder, who settled in Missouri after her marriage. Missouri is also the home of our tale today, a tale of a remarkable case of infatuation. Charles Kring was the son of Frederick Hermann Kring and Charlotte Ebenezer Kring. He was born in Darmstadt, Germany, on January 4, 1845. The family came to America from Germany in 1866, and in the fall of 1869, Charles married Margaretha Recker in Illinois. A daughter they named Emma was born to the couple in 1870. The next year, the family moved to St. Louis, where Charles, who had apprenticed as an apothecary in his native Germany, went into the drugstore business. With financial backing from his father, he opened a drugstore in DeQuin, Illinois. The business prospered for a time, but in the spring of 1872, Charles' father withdrew his financial support for the project, and he had to sell the store. Shortly afterward, little Emma died, throwing Charles into despondency. He and Margaretha briefly moved away, and upon their return to the city, Jacob Broomseer offered Charles a job as a clerk in his drugstore that was located in a St. Louis suburb. When Charles assumed the position in September, Jacob introduced him to his wife, Dora. Charles was immediately drawn to the beautiful 25-year-old woman. It was reported by some that Charles and Margaretha did not have the happiest of marriage, even before their daughter died, and it was not any better now. The job at Jacob's pharmacy didn't last very long. Jacob had insured the store for more than it was worth, and that October, he burned it down to collect the insurance. Charles took a temporary job at a drugstore in St. Louis, but after a few days, Jacob, who'd received his insurance money, tried to persuade Charles into going back into business with him. He refused at first, but relented after Jacob sent his wife to personally plead the case, and after Dora did plead with him to join them, Charles agreed, investing more money from his father. Dora helped out in her husband's store, and during the winter of 1872-1873, she and Charles were often left alone together when Jacob made trips to St. Louis. Gradually, they fell in love, or became infatuated with each other, as Margaretha later described their relationship. According to Charles, Jacob confided that he had indeed burned his store to collect the insurance, but Charles kept that secret even after Jacob burned the second store in April of 1873. Charles kept this secret because he did not want to disgrace Dora, Jacob's wife. Charles, who had reconciled with his father, even agreed to help finance a new partnership. So apparently Charles and his father were often on the outs over Charles's constant need for financial backing or financial help. By the time that Charles had got in good with his father again and had offered to help finance a new partnership with Jacob, Jacob had begun to suspect his wife and Charles had feelings for each other. But according to some, he didn't really seem to mind that much. Either he naively trusted them not to betray their marriage vows, or, as Margaretha believed, he was trading upon his wife's virtue. In the summer of 1873, the Krings and Broomsers moved to Mud Creek, Illinois, where Charles and Jacob began again to open another drugstore business. Jacob spent a lot of time away from the store, and Charles and Dora grew more and more attached, and they finally declared their love for each other and became intimate. They managed to keep the intimate affair a secret for more than a year, but Jacob, having had suspicions, one night caught them together. Like Jacob, Margaretha also was beginning to suspect her spouse of being unfaithful, but she would not let herself believe it at first, for she too was charmed by Dora. Only when Jacob, apparently exasperated by his wife's attention to Charles, confronted Margaretha with a love letter that Charles had written to Dora, did Margaretha finally leave Charles, and she returned to her parents' home. Jacob then took $10,000 from the store, and left Charles with all of the debt. 2 households had been destroyed. Not long after the separation, Charles and the Bruises moved to Nashville, Illinois. I know we're supposed to talk about Missouri, and we will. We're talking about Missouri, but background happened in Illinois. Anyway, Jacob was away on business most of the time, and Charles and Dora, according to Charles's story, lived almost as husband and wife. A female resident of Nashville, Illinois, later confirmed that everybody in the small town knew of an infatuation that existed between Charles Crane and Dora Bruises. So they lived together in the same house. People in town knew that they weren't married. They had different last names, which was not common then, and just didn't worry about it. I don't know. Seems weird for the late 1800s, but okay, whatever. So Jacob and Dora were still unable to make a living, so when Jacob returned from one of his trips, he came with a plan for opening a patent medicine business. And he wanted Charles to join them again as business partners. So once again, Charles went to his father for financial backing. Dora then resumed living with her husband as his wife, but she was still seeing Charles on the side. Their business continued to not do well. Okay, what are these 2 men? Oh my gosh, they should never, ever, ever go in business together again. But whatever. So this next business was still not doing well, and Charles was shouldering the debt, but not seeing any of the revenue. When he confronted Jacob for a settlement, he was surprised to see Dora take her husband's side. So after that, they dissolved their partnership, thank goodness, and they departed company. In late in 1873, the Bruises moved back to St. Louis, Missouri, and Charles soon followed. Now, keep in mind that Margaretha has already gone back to her parents. She has left her husband. Dora was several months pregnant when they moved back to St. Louis, and Charles was convinced he was the baby's father, probably because Jacob was traveling all the time. He confronted Dora, demanding to know whether she would leave her husband and marry him. She would not give him a definite answer and instead led him to believe she was contemplating aborting the child. Now, greatly distressed by this news, remember, Charles has already lost one child. Charles began to believe that Dora had, after all, only been playing with his affections to get him to go along with her husband's criminal schemes and provide capital for Jacob's business ventures. That sounds like a reasonable explanation for this whole scenario. I'm just saying. Charles is a little bit too blinded by love. I don't know. Charles declared his intentions to kill Dora if she refused to leave her husband. If Charles could not have the woman he loved, no one else would have her either. Now, a lot of this story is based on what Charles himself reportedly said. However, we know from reports at the time, news reports at the time, that after receiving a very brief New Year's greeting from Dora, Charles penned a letter to her on January 2nd, 1875. In this letter, he again stated his intent to kill her if she did not leave Jacob, her husband. On the morning of the 3rd, he wrote another note to her, threatening that they would soon lie in one grave, quote, "for we have laid criminally in one bed," end quote. She did not still agree to marry him. On the evening of January 4th, he went to the house with a message for Dora, and she came outside with her sister-in-law, Amanda. So when Dora moved back to St. Louis, originally, she moved in with her in-laws before her husband and Charles came back into the picture. Anyway, Charles asked Dora if she would become his wife, and he described her response as, quote, "And if say no, will your heart break? Oh, I pity you, big fellow." Her words, he said, tantalized him, and her cruel mocking drove me to madness and to fury. So Charles recalled all the shame and financial ruin she had caused him Anne in an instant became convinced that she had only been playing a part. She had feigned love to get his money. He asked her again if she would become his wife, and with a smile she said no. Then he pulled out a revolver he had purchased earlier in the day and shot her twice. He then pointed the gun at his own heart and tried to fire, but the gun did not go off. Charles then went to the police station and turned himself in. The mortally wounded Dora died a few days later. Okay, so here comes the part or the reason why I chose this story, because we've already heard all that story before, right? Three's a crowd, somebody ends up dead. This is not a new story, but what happens next was intriguing to me. So, during the preliminary hearing, when Jacob Bruises was on the witness stand, Charles picked up a chair and attempted to assault him. To prevent a similar incident at his trial, Charles was in handcuffs during the proceedings. At first, he wanted to plead guilty and denounce Jacob from the scaffold. So basically, he was going to plead guilty and say that Jacob and Dora drove him to it because they had been swindling him. But his attorneys convinced him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Now remember that it was reported that after Jacob's daughter died, he was very despondent. He had a breakdown, which rightly so, right? He's lost a business and his daughter has died. So, yeah, rightly so. A daughter from Illinois, where they moved after the death of their daughter, testified that Charles had shown symptoms of epilepsy and cataplexy. Catatonic, when you're catatonic. Okay. Several other witnesses testified that he acted oddly at times, and they also testified that his father was eccentric and had a violent temper, and that his half-sister was either an imbecile or subject to melancholia. So either she was not smart or suffered from depression. Okay, and somehow all of these things were meant to prove to the jury that Charles was not of sound mind when he both fell in love with and then murdered Dora. The jury did not buy it. They deliberated for 16 hours, and then on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1875, Charles was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to hang. His attorneys appealed on the grounds that appearing in handcuffs had unduly prejudiced the jury against Charles. The Supreme Court of Missouri granted him a new trial. In the second trial, beginning May 20th, 1878, a juryman became ill and no conclusion was reached. So there was a third trial, which began January 29th, 1879, and it ended in a hung jury. The fourth trial began on November 11th, 1879, nearly a whole year. There was a delay due to difficulty in finding a jury of 12 men who had not read the newspapers and already formed an opinion of the case. Charles's attorneys refused to proceed until they were paid some of what they were owed, but his resources were exhausted. He has given all of his money to Jacob and Dora, and he's got nothing left. His father's not going to give him any more. Charles decided then to plead guilty of second-degree murder. And he had a deal in place with the prosecutor and was expected to be sentenced for 2 to 5 years in prison. The judge accepted his plea of second-degree murder, but then sentenced Charles to 25 years in the penitentiary. When Charles heard the sentence, he entered a motion to withdraw his guilty plea of second-degree murder and re-enter his plea of not guilty to first-degree murder. So here comes the interesting part, or the more interesting part. The motion was granted and Charles was given a new trial in May of 1881. This time he was found guilty of first-degree murder and again sentenced to hang. The verdict was appealed but upheld by the Missouri Supreme Court. Okay. The ruling was then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The issue was that at the time of the sentencing, When he was sentenced for second-degree murder, when he pled guilty, under Missouri law, a conviction for second-degree murder meant an acquittal of murder in the first degree. So because he pled guilty and the judge accepted that plea, even though he took it back when the sentencing wasn't what he expected, the Missouri law said that he could not be convicted of murder in the first degree, which is what happened at the next trial. So Charles could not be retried on the greater charge because he had pled his plea had been accepted for second-degree murder. However, in between his lawyers filing the appeal and the court case on the appeal being heard, the law was changed. And it was changed so that in cases like Charles's, it would be proper to charge with a greater offense. So in between this whole appeal and hearing the trial, Missouri wised up, I suppose, if that's what they wanted to think, and changed the law so that if you were found guilty of a lesser crime, you could still be convicted of the greater crime. Okay. Let's see, where was I? The Missouri Supreme Court applied the second law and denied the appeal. So the U.S. Supreme Court said that the second law was quote, ex post facto, meaning that was the law they had to go by. Missouri had to use the law that was in effect at the time that Charles pled guilty and his plea was received and recorded by the court. They couldn't then, even though he rescinded, they couldn't then go back and charge him with first-degree murder. All they could do at best was charge him with second-degree murder. So in April of 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court sustained the motion for a new trial. Charles had entered prison 8 years earlier, weighing 190 pounds. On his release, he was a mere skeleton, feeble and consumptive, meaning he had tuberculosis, and he was sick. He was released on bond and removed to the hospital. He died in the hospital on May 17th before having to face a sixth trial. Most of the people on the streets of St. Louis, when asked by the newspaper reporters at the time, expressed the sentiment that he had sufficiently paid for his crime. So this case, from a legal standpoint, has been and still is regarded by many as the most remarkable in the annals of criminal history in the country. Now, it was not hard to find crime cases from Missouri in the 1800s. I mean, good grief, Jesse James and his gang were born and began their crime spree in Missouri. But I was fascinated by this crime in that it kind of set precedent, about how we can and cannot treat people who are on trial. The first being that his handcuffs made him appear guilty to the jury. I know a lot of times we see people today who are restrained or in handcuffs because they are a flight risk or a danger to the others in the courtroom. And I kind of have always wondered what kind of, what's the right word? I can't think. Oh my gosh, guys, words are hard. What we're telling people. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not a criminal's friend. In fact, in my early days when I was going to be a lawyer, not a mom, my plan was to work for the prosecutor, not the defense. But I do honestly believe that everybody's entitled to a fair trial. So I was really intrigued by this case in that his outburst in a preliminary hearing caused the handcuffs to be placed on him during trial, which in his attorney's opinion caused him to be found guilty. Okay. I also was intrigued, or I don't know, my brain was turned on by the 8 cases, or 8 trials, or 6 trials, I guess it was 6 trials, plus appeals, right? he had good attorneys, y'all. They found all kinds of reasons, legal reasons, to have him retried. And it was kind of sneaky of the state of Missouri to change their law after the appeal, but before the hearing, to see if they could get away with trying him for a crime that legally at the time they could not. So anyway, that is why I chose this case. Like I said, it's, in the middle there, it's not exactly a news story, but I thought it was interesting. Another interesting thing is I could not find pictures of Jacob. I know, weird, right? I could not find a genealogy of Jacob or Dora, except that I did find on Find a Grave Dora's headstone, and she was also born in Germany near where Charles was born. I did not find ancestry on Charles other than his parents and his wife and a child, an unnamed child, which one source named her as Emma. I did not find an ancestry on Dora. Now, I will admit that, this is my first week back from being out for surgery, and I didn't spend a ton of time looking. But, however, this is a long babble. Sorry, you guys. I did find pictures of Charles and Dora. So here is a picture, oh my goodness, y'all, of Charles F. Kring. And here's a picture of Dora Bromiser. I'm totally butchering that name, I'm sure. Thank you so much for hanging in to the end. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I have added a couple of other videos here I think you would like, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment below. Tell me what you think about this case. Give me a thumbs up and have a great, great week.